Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So, this is the uh this is the Parasha Vayechi. And I will get into what Vayechi means, but this parasha kind of is the other side of the holidays, right? We've gone through the new year, as it were. We've gotten through the Hanukkah season. We've gotten through the Christmas season. We've gotten through the winter solstice, and we've gotten through all the other stuff that's kind of tied into the calendar that the world, but mainly the English speaking world uses. The relief that I feel being on the other side of the holidays is good. There's a feeling in my heart, however, and I have much more to learn about this, that the collective conscience of humans is geared towards a New Year's resolution at this time. And I have felt the pressure, the influence of that spiritual momentum, even though that January is related to the false god Janus. And we know that in Deuteronomy 32, it says that Janus is actually not a god, but a demon. 32, 16, and 17. Now, I think it's important as we go into this season that, and when I say season, there is a season going on right now. And actually, we've discussed it a little bit, and I'm going to discuss it a little bit more at length today. But the principle is that as we go through this, there is a need for you to disassociate yourself from the peer influence that says that this is the new year. And when I say peer influence, it's not just people saying Happy New Year. There is a spirit of Janus in operation right now as a principality or a power over the world who has accepted the Roman holiday of Janus as the new year, instead of Pesach being the beginning of months, Passover being the beginning of months. Oh wait, Passover was cut by the Council of Nicaea. So that definitely isn't relevant anymore either in their context and in their eyes. And then, of course, we have the civil new year, by which Yom Kippur, Jubilees, and Shemitah is calculated. And so in all of this, be strong in your mind that you needn't create a resolution because the calendar of Rome flipped. And I want to also say that in that, there's going to be a necessity to overcome the guilt and the other things that are associated with the god Janus. Do your research, and you'll find that the New Year's resolution is actually a vow to Janus. And if you don't vow, then Janus has a tendency to be reactive to you. Do your research. Now, having said all that, it's intriguing that there's an element of power behind the parasha this week. What do I mean by power? Well, I'm about to explain that. So let's start with a viewing of the scroll to begin with, okay? And in principle, all I want to do is I want to show you a couple things, okay? The first thing that I would like you to see is that right here are the blessings over the children of Israel in this Torah portion. Over here, almost out of the screen, is this big gap. That big gap is Shemot. That big gap is Exodus. Bereshit is done. The season of in the beginning is done. The season of Genesis is done. And with that comes an end to everything that pertains to. I don't completely understand that. Now, there is some things I would like you to see. I think the first one is that normally we have these little breaks right here, okay? We have these here, these little breaks. And those are called parashas, and some of them are called stumas, and some of them are called petuachs. The petuach is usually a gap from the margin over, and the stumachs are the parasha breaks that are from inside of the text. So this would be a petuach, stumach. Now, the reason that's important is usually, for example, if we were to go back on the scroll just a smidge, usually a parasha begins in one of those section breaks. For example, here's last week's portion, Vayigash, okay? Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because this has a very unique break. Now, there are some people who believe that even the parashas were actually a revelation from the Father, okay? So, the reason why that is relevant is because the actual break in this parasha is Veyechi, right? It is and he lived, and who lived? Jacob lived, and it's that he lived 17 years. So let me show you really quick. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want you to see the Torah scroll as it is being communicated, because there's something significant that occurs. Okay, so having said that, I'm going to pull up Genesis chapter 47, and in that we're going to have the parasha beginning in verse 28. And of course, that's right here. I'm going to go ahead and highlight that real quick. Okay. Jacob lived for 17 years after his arrival in Egypt. So he lived 147 years in all. Let's go into the Hebrew. So you see right here is Veyechi. Veyechi Yaakov be'aretz. Now, switching back to our scroll, what we have is we have breaks, right? Like I showed you, breaks in the text. However, this particular parasha actually begins without a parasha break, right here. Vayechi Yaakov be'aretz. Let me switch back to this. Vayechi Yaakov be'aretz. Vayechi Yaakov be'aretz. Now, there's a few reasons why this is important. The first is if we accept that these breaks, now let me tell you what there is not, okay? What you see right here, next to Vegehi, where it says 28, that did not exist. And what's really important for you to know is the actual legitimate breaks in Torah are not communicated in a regular text of the Bible. No version of scripture except for the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which basically is it's a codex. It's the Stuttgart Codex of Torah, and basically the Tanakh. But what's important about the Biblia Hebraica is that it gives the little samek and the pei where the actual breaks are. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because there is something anomalous here. And if we accept that this whole thing is God-breathed, then the Father put something here very important. And it is, he lived. Now, in order to understand the full context of this, what we need to do is go into some previous text in Scripture, and in Torah specifically, in the Word of God. We need to go and we need to actually see something that happened with Jacob. Okay? And so we're going to be going to Genesis chapter 32. I'm sorry, Genesis chapter 31. And you know what? Actually, it's not. It's actually Genesis 28. My mistake. So what we have here is Jacob's dream. And what I want you to see is the highlighted part. And I didn't highlight this part in preparation for this sermon. I highlighted this part the last time we were here, because this was a few parashas ago when we saw Jacob making a vow. And this is the vow that he made. And we're going to talk about vows. If God will indeed be with me and protect me on this journey, and if he will provide me with food and clothing, and if I return safely to my father's home, then Yahweh will certainly be my God. And this memorial pillar I have set up will become a place for worshiping God, and I will present to God a tenth of everything he gives me. A vow has been made. But there's something else involved here. And that is the voicing of the vow as a covenantal statement. If you do, I will do. He's offering covenant to the Father. So here is the part that's important. He says in verse 20, if God indeed will be with me. Okay? If God indeed will be with me. And look at 21. And if I return safely to my father's home. Now, I want to talk a minute about death. In the context of the expiration of a human being, a ceasing of that person, an unaliving, as it were, that is death in the sense of a human's mind. We look at death and we say that is the expiration of that person. And the tomb says that, or I'm not sorry, the tombstone says date to date. From this date to this date. For Q, who would rather not admit it, 1976 to this date will be on my tombstone. There's some parts that are important about that. And of course, there are some people who really, really concentrate on the beginning of that or the end of that and not necessarily the hyphen in between. And I know that's cliche and sounds a bit Christian pulpit, but it's true. There are a lot of people that do not focus on the hyphen. But what's intriguing is that Yaakov expires in this parasha. And not only does he expire, but he is laid in the land of his fathers. Looky here. If I return to my father's home in safety, then Yahweh will certainly be my Elohim. Now, why is this important? For two reasons. First of all, Yaakov's head laid down in the bed in death in safety of the protection of his own son. And under the context of provision from his own son. The greatest function of honoring your mother and father is not that you obey them. And it's not that you would it's not that you would be a good kid or be a good teenager or be a good adult to them. It's that they would lay their head down in shalom because they were in safety and because they were in provision. Look what Yeshua says to the Pharisees. He says, you guys, it is written, honor your mother and father. You know, usually Yeshua starts something like that saying, it is written, you have heard it said, or it is written, but I say. But in this one, he says, it is written, honor your mother and father, and yet you say that if a man takes his inheritance and gives it to the temple for korban, then it is acceptable that he didn't give it to his parents. What does this mean? This means that Yeshua gave emphasis to the fact that honoring your mother and father was that their head would lay down in peace, in shalom. Remember, the father's covenant with Abraham said, you will go your way to your fathers in shalom. Isaac laid his head down in shalom. Yaakov laid his head down in shalom. And so the reason why this is important is because even though that it says, and he lived, Yaakov returned to his father's place in safety. You see, there is an element here of the idea that Jacob set the standard by which Yahweh would be his God. Meaning what? There were other options on the table. But see, he had learned from his father that Yahweh was God, and he had learned from his father the truth of Torah, even though that it was written on their hearts at this time. And it was with understanding that Jacob received a blessing from Isaac. When I say with understanding, is Isaac knew how to bless the son that was supposed to be blessed. As to who that was, we're not going to get into that teaching today. But what we will say is that Yaakov had a knowledge of God, but he was not intimate with him. What is the difference between knowing who God is and him and knowing God? Well, it's simple. Your God will live up to the standard of your belief on what God is supposed to be. Now, the most unfortunate element of this entire discussion at this point is that a good percentage of humanity is not self-actualized. What does that mean? That they would have the gall, because of the fact that they don't need external validation. You see, external validation means you have to be approved of by others, and therefore the majority says, God is this, and here's what you can expect from him. But I will share with you that although that's true, there's a function of this embedded in an understanding that when a person becomes self-actualized and they actually feel that internal validation, which is what? The meritless favor of the Father, and understanding it doesn't matter what they think. It doesn't matter what you think I'm doing right or wrong or any of that other stuff. What matters is what he cares about. And then also, and this is important, what he has told you to do. So part of having someone be your God would be that you do what that God has as tenets, as requirements. So if you're worshiping Molech, you're supposed to sacrifice your baby. But if you're worshiping Yahweh, you are supposed to keep Torah. And that would have been Jacob's understanding. So when he says, if you'll do these things, you'll be my God, I propose to you that although he has laid it out, I mean, because this is kind of a future tense thing, right? This is what we would call a subjunction. And basically the whole idea is that basically you are, you're creating a scenario that is past tense as if it is going to happen in the future. How many times do we say, oh, I wish I were there? Okay, those are all past tense words. Because what we do with the subjunctive is we actually create the scenario as if it's already happened and we desire it. And so what's interesting is, as Jacob makes this vow, as he's stating, if God will indeed be with me and protect me on this journey, and if he will provide me with food and clothing, and if I return safely to my father's home, then Yahweh will certainly be my Elohim. But here's the part that's important. Did he live like a heathen until then? Or did he maintain a lifestyle, as we will see as we look into the scripture, if we will maintain, did he maintain a lifestyle of Torah when he was in Padam Aram, when he was in the place of his forefathers, and when he was in the land that was not the promised land? And this is important, while he was gone from that place, was there evidence that Yahweh, yes, provided for him, protected him? Look at Laban. Laban pursues him because of the stolen gods. But what happens? Laban says, I had a dream last night, right? I had a dream last night that I am neither to speak good or evil of you. and they made a covenant. Now, there's a few reasons why this is important. The first reason is because Jacob vowed a vow that he would do a certain thing and that Yahweh would be required to do a certain thing, and that would mean that he was his God. So I'm going to throw out there something. If there was ever a time where the father did not come through for Jacob, Jacob had a right to not live by Torah. Okay? The Torah written on his heart. If there was ever a time where Jacob was not provided for, protected, and fed, he could have violated the fact that Yahweh was his Elohim. Which means that every single last time that there would have been some sort of issue that would have created some sort of limitation that would have appeared to be the father not providing, the father had to come through. Now, there are people that say, oh, well, that would have been a timing thing. Yes and no, because we see every single function of Jacob's operation when he is in the land of Paddan Aram having an immediate effect. Now, here's the irony. The dude served Laban for a long time. A long time. All right. So it is very important in that thinking, in the box that we have Jacob in our brains, to understand that this didn't happen overnight. But whenever there was something that arose that would have called into question the covenant that Jacob made with the father, I promise you it was immediately taken care of. Because I'm going to share something with you that might be a frustration to some of you, and that is that the father will defend his character. The father will defend his character. Now, the reason why all of this is relevant is because of the fact that it says, and he lived. Yaakov went through a lot of stuff. Jacob suffered significantly with him being in love with the one who definitely was not righteous. Him having the unloved wife and therefore having to give inheritance to children who he didn't favor. He had many manipulations from Laban. He had Esau pursue him to kill his own brother. He had encounters with the people of Shechem, then encounters with the people of Egypt. But he lived. And I believe that the reason why there's an anomaly in the Torah scroll is because it is called out. Look at these breaks. Look at all these breaks. Okay? Sometimes a parasha will start at the top like this. Sometimes it'll start in the middle like this, but this one starts flat in the middle of the text. You can't see that in the English, and you can't see that in a Bible. And you can't even see that in compendiums of scrolls, because sometimes they'll break right here because of those two dots. But what I want you to see is it's not an actual parasha break. There's an anomaly here. And that anomaly is the Father's way of saying, here's the testimony that I was what Jacob required of me to be God. And therefore Jacob accepted me as his God. And when he blesses his son in this parasha, he makes sure to make mention that he was saved, that he was protected. I'll show you what I mean. So in Genesis chapter 48, we of course see the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, when Ephraim and Manasseh are brought in and he says these blessings, before he does, he says, I'm going to adopt these two, right? But then look, he blessed Joseph in verse 15. He blessed Joseph, all right? In verse 15, he says, then he blessed Joseph and said, may the God before whom my grandfather Abraham and my father Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this very day, and the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they preserve my name and the names of Abraham and Isaac, and may their descendants multiply greatly throughout the earth. Even at this time of blessing, Jacob testifies, he protected me. And so when Veyechi says, and he lived, forget about that it says 17 years. Because this one anomalous parasha break testifies that he lived, therefore God was God. But we also have the death of Jacob in this parasha. So we have death and life contained in the parasha. And what's intriguing is if you look at what is in between, okay? So let's go ahead and let's do this, okay? Let's look at what is in between. So going back to verse 47, I'm sorry, verse 28 of chapter 47, Jacob lived for 17 years. Let's ignore the 17 and let's just go Jacob lived, okay? Then we will go to the end of 49, breathed his last and joined his ancestors in death. Now, from and he lived to the word death, there's a lot that has gone on. But I want you to see what was created in the life and death of Yaakov. First of all, and this is important, he blessed each of the sons of Israel as what? As tribes, and how and what they would do and what would happen with them. Okay? Number two, he created the mechanism by which Yeshua would be able to provide a way for all of the world to be redeemed, saved, sanctified, and adopted when he created the adoption mechanism within Ephraim and Manasseh. Remember, they were born as Gentiles in a Gentile land without the process of Joseph marrying within his tribe, and Jacob knew it. And so Ephraim and Manasseh had to be adopted to Jacob. But when we look in the book of Romans, Paul makes a statement that is clearly the result of Jacob's process. And it is this. It's in Romans chapter 8. And we will be looking at verse 15. So you have not received a spirit that makes you fearful slaves. Instead, you received God's Spirit when he adopted you as his own children, and now we call him Abba, Father. The spirit of adoption is initiated by Jacob's adoption of Ephraim. Again, there is words being spoken here. Yaakov says they will be called by my name. Notice they're not the sons of Joseph. There are a few references to Joseph after this in the process of Ephraim and Manasseh, or in the process of prophecy, like in Ezekiel 37. But Yaakov says they will be named sons of Israel, and they were. There is no tribe of Joseph surrounding the tabernacle. There's a tribe of Ephraim, and there's a tribe of Manasseh, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so again, we see words being used. Isaac, when he blesses Jacob, thinking it's Esau, and again, that's a teaching for another time, but what he says is when Esau says, do you have a blessing for me? He says, I gave him the dew of heaven. Isaac did not think in his head that it was a request to heaven. He did not think in his head that God was going to maybe do this for Jacob. He gave Jacob the dew of heaven with his mouth, with his words. Meaning what? Was Isaac a prophet? There's no indication anywhere in Scripture that Isaac gave a prophecy that would qualify him under the Deuteronomy 13 and 18 test that he was a prophet, and yet he spoke. And what happened? He said, I've already given him the dew of heaven. He believed he had done that. And now here Jacob is creating a function of adoption through words. And furthermore, as we look into this, the next thing that we see is what? The blessing and curses upon the children of Israel that clearly came to pass. The scattering, the blessing, the betrayals, the darkness of the tribes, the light of the tribes. There's a lot of people who would say, oh, well, Jacob saw the future and therefore prophesied. Because why? Because there was a sense of belief that a seer could see the future. Now, there were those who may have not had that gift, but that wasn't a prophet. A prophet was somebody who declared something a certain way, and it came to pass, like when Moses says, this hasn't happened before, but since y'all are so screwed up in the head, we're going to deal with you. Let the earth open up and swallow you whole, alive, your whole family, your tents, everything. And it did. It's very important to understand the function of language in that sense, to know what you're speaking. There's obviously a necessity for there to be intent, and that makes sense, right? You can't just, even Yeshua said, don't say vain repetitions. You know, I could pull out my prayer book right now for Shabbos, and I could say the words in Hebrew, and I could daven, and I could cover my head, and I could do the book and read the book. But unless there was a deep conviction in my heart of what I was praying, who cares? It's meaningless. It's just as meaningless as the the feast days were to the Father when Israel was just keeping them to keep them. He said, they're detestable to me. You disgust me with them. Now, anti-Semitics and antinomians would love to say, that's proof right there he was going to reform this stuff, that he was going to take away the feast days and replace it with a pagan holiday Easter. But the truth is that's definitely not the case. Because however much it bothered him for people to not be in the operation of intention, it bothered him even more that they would, what? Do the customs of the nations around him. Go read Isaiah 66. Go read Zechariah 14. Because you will find that he is very zealous for his Torah. Even then. So we have the life of Jacob and the death of Jacob. We have Chai and Mutz. And we have the hyphen. Right? We have the beginning and end of Yaakov, the expiration of the human body, and a statement and testimony of life based upon an anomaly. But what's intriguing is that this goes a step further. And it's quite interesting because as I was asking the Father, what in the world is the message this week? Because I just really didn't feel like there was just one of those clear tunnel vision, straight up, here's the question, meditate on the answer, explodes on Shabbat situation. I was very much off my square this week. Until a word came to me claiming to be the word of the Lord. And for a few days, I was asking him why he had said that to me and why he had sent that message to me. And he reminded me of something very, very important and significant. He said, I never said a word fitly spoken was always fit. You see, this is how I understand it, and this is the function of what he showed me. Since his character is at stake, remember, his character was at stake with Jacob's vow and covenant he made with him. And he was able to name the conditions by which he would walk the walk with God. But what's intriguing about that is God fulfilled it. Again, Jacob does not fit the definition of prophet until this parasha. But back then, he did not fit the definition of prophet. He was not dreaming dreams. They were not coming to pass. And he was definitely not guiding the people through revelation from the Father. But he still vows this vow and it comes to pass, etc., etc. But there's another element here that's important, and that is God's character was in question. Would he provide? Would he protect? Would he instruct? And that is where we arrive at some intriguing information. And that intriguing information is he will defend his character. In fact, it says that he would defend his character many times in the prophets, many times in the writings, many times in Torah. Can we set the standard by which that character would exist? Well, yes, of course we can say, you know what? I don't know how many times I had that experience where I was like, if you are God, then do this, and he would do it. But there's another element here, and that is within the idea that his character, according to Moshe, starts with racham, starts with compassion, and his actions of promise, basically kind of not necessarily a promise in the sense of a promise being a good thing, but in the sense of saying, hey, if you do this thing wrong, this is how I'm going to deal with you. But his character that he declares to Moses is racham. That's the first word when he passes by Moses and puts him in the cleft of the rock. Racham. Meaning what? Meaning that there is actually a default process with him. So there's something you need to know. He will not kick you when you're down. If you are already being humbled and a messenger comes to you, condemning you or giving more advice or creating more guilt, he hasn't sent him. If he has already begun the process of humbling you through some difficult situation and a messenger comes, I will finish this thought, but I am reminded at this time about what happened with Peter. So let's talk a minute about Peter. Yeshua and his disciples are at Caesarea Philippi. And there, while they are discussing things, Yeshua says, "Who do the people say that I am?" And of course, they say, well, some say you're the prophet. What prophet? The prophet Moses spoke of in Deuteronomy 18. Some say you're the Messiah. Some say you're a good teacher. And then Peter declares, "Thou art the Christ." And he says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for it is not from human lips that those words came, but from my Father in heaven through you." Thus declaring that Peter had the ability to utter, to give utterance. Okay? Then what happens? Then they are on the road discussing everything, and Yeshua says, "Now that you know who the Christ is, let me explain to you what has to happen to him." Why was he doing that? Because everybody was expecting the son of David, but Yeshua was the son of Joseph. And it's really important that in that process, that it is understood that that meant that there would be suffering. And he says that he would suffer, that he would die, that he would be betrayed. And Peter pulls him to the side. And if you read it in the Greek, not the English, he actually begins to pronounce a blessing over Yeshua by saying, "Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy." So, Lord, have mercy. There's a couple ways that we could look at that. And obviously, the word there is kurios in the Greek. And that word kurios does mean Lord. And so we could say that he was saying it to Yeshua, calling him Lord and asking him to have the mercy on the disciples and not say these things. Or we could look at it from the point of view that he believed the Yeshua's words that he would be betrayed, suffer, and die. And he was asking the Father of Yeshua to have mercy on Yeshua. A very good plan, a very good intention, not wickedness, not words of accusation, not rekilus or lashon hara. Rekilus, damaging the reputation of someone's life. Lashon hara, speaking negative words about another person. But Lord, have mercy. And what was Yeshua's response? Yeshua's response was, "Get thee behind me, Satan, for you do not know of what spirit you are." Now, when he encounters the demon-possessed man, he says, "Come out of him." When he encounters the action of Judas' betrayal, it says Satan entered his heart. But Peter, he rebukes as Satan. He doesn't say, "Come out of him." He doesn't say, "What is your name?" Right? Because when he addressed the other demons, he said, "What is your name?" And the demon told him his name. Do you see this? Peter didn't say, you know what, this guy's kind of a kook, Lashon hara. You know what, he's not the Messiah, because the Messiah is supposed to deliver us from Rome, Rekilus. He said, "Lord, have mercy." A blessing. You need to understand the level at which this lesson with Yeshua corresponds to your tongue. James says it's full of poison. James says your mouth has blessings and cursings in them, and that ought not be. Moshe says when he's presenting Torah to the people, he rolls out the scroll and he points to it and he says, "Behold, I set before you today, and I call heaven and earth as witness, death and life, a blessing and a curse. Choose life that you may live." And so I want you to think about your good intentions. I can tell you, until this occurred with me this week, where I had a friend with good intentions present to me a "thus saith the Lord" scenario, and it caused me to tailspin so thoroughly that it took days to recover, because I was already being humbled. And he came along and hit me while I was down. But because he's my friend, I perceived that it would be the word of the Father. And it wasn't until later that the Father said, "I already taught you, kid. I won't kick you when you're down. Remember what I told Peter. Get thee behind me, Satan." Why is this important? Because now we get into the function that when Jacob blessed and cursed his children, he knew exactly what he was doing. It was not future revelation. His son, Joseph, was the one that had the dreams, right? Now people say, "Oh, well, what about the dream with Jacob?" It wasn't a future dream, was it? No, it was a present dream. It was a present tense, right? Okay. There may be those who say, "Oh, no, he had a dream, therefore he's prophet." Okay, fine. But what Jacob declared was going to happen to his children. He blessed and cursed his children. How many of you have an understanding that your children may need a curse on them? Only the one I know of is Jacob. There's nobody who I can think of who would say that that needs to occur. But what's interesting is we get into a premise of an ebb and flow. And when we get into the premise of an ebb and flow, what I mean is there's death and life in the power of the tongue, and blessing and cursings come out of the tongue, and that ought not be. So then my question is was James ignorant of what happened with Jacob? No, he was not. Jacob still made sure to say of his children and to his children the things that he said, right? The way that he said them. But I think it's important in that process to see that that doesn't necessarily equate to destruction. It can, but it doesn't equate to destruction. But Moses says, behold, I set before you a blessing and a curse, death and life. Now, there is definitely a function of the expiration of the body when it comes to a punishment of a sin unto death. And Yeshua did take the death penalty, but John took it serious enough that he felt that there still was a consequence for a sin unto death. He said, don't pray for that one. Don't pray for somebody who's committing a sin unto death. Now, I'm sure that that also goes into the function of rabbis speaking in extremes, because you guys don't realize this, because we live in a Western social democratic culture, that in Eastern cultures, making extreme statements emphasized the emotion of the statement, not necessarily the extremity of the statement. For example, when Paul says, I wish that you would mutilate yourselves, it is very, very important for you to know that that is an extraordinarily immature, and not only that, but very, very inappropriate thing to say, if we take it in the context of a Western social democratic understanding. Because make no mistake, that's your culture, people. A Western social democratic culture. And because of that fact, you are missing a very big piece of the puzzle, and that is culture. And in the culture of rabbis, in the culture of Jews, in the culture of Hebrews, in the culture of Middle Eastern people, you say extreme things to put emphasis. It's called speaking in the big and the little. So, for example, you could say, I wish you would kill yourself. And people would say, oh, wait a minute, that's speaking death. But the truth is what is being said there is you're so out of order, you deserve death. But what if it was an argument over the price of something? That's how it is. That's how things are spoken there. But what's important is to understand that big and little. So we would minimize things. For example, that sheep is so blemished, not even Laban would be worthy of it. And you're negotiating to say that that sheep is probably a little bit less worth than what it was. They speak with extremes. And so you need to understand that there is an element here where there's appropriate speech and inappropriate speech, but there's also a cultural involvement in that speech. The reason I bring this up is because we know that Proverbs says that death and life are in the power of the tongue, but you don't even know what death and life are. You don't. You think you do because you want to say that life is the non-expiration of a human. And you think that death is the expiration of a human. That's not the case. I'll prove it to you. So, first of all, in order to really get the thought process down, we're going to go look at those two words in this parasha.